Hi guys, welcome back to the History Fields YouTube channel. Like I'm sure many of you have, I've been fascinated over the past week or so following the story of the missing submersible Titan that disappeared with 5 people aboard. For dating purposes, it's late June of 2023. For the briefest of summaries, the tiny underwater vehicle set out last week with its 5 passengers to explore a legendary deep-sea destination, of course, the wreckage of Titanic. The Coast Guard announced, and again this is late June, that 5 days after it went missing, the submersible had actually imploded. They found pieces of Titan about 1,600 feet from the wreckage of Titanic. And obviously this is a tragic outcome for all 5 people aboard the vessel and their families. So I wrote and researched this story as the search was ongoing. I thought it might be a chance and opportunity to give you all some history on the discovery of Titanic's wreckage, which happened in 1985 by Dr. Robert Ballard. Of course, the ship famously sank during its maiden voyage in 1912 after colliding with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 people died in the disaster, and from the moment the news became public, the story was a global sensation. And in the years following, of course, one of the very first reactions people had was to wonder if the sunken ship could be found and retrieved. First groups that invested money and time into trying to raise Titanic was the families of the victims, and this especially included some of the wealthier members like the Guggenheims and the Astors. These families created a consortium to look into seeing if raising the wreckage might be possible, only to quickly realize the technology just simply didn't exist at the time. Among the many problems, one of them was that the sunken ship had continued to drift as it went down into the icy waters. Because of this, nobody knew exactly where the ship rested. Submarines were still a very new invention, and the wreck was going to be way too deep for divers to reach. And as an example, this is an image that shows just how far down Titanic is from the surface of the ocean. It's 12,000 feet and over 2.5 miles. To show how primitive some of the thinking was around this, there were some bizarre suggestions to raise the Titanic through the years. This consortium in particular tossed around the idea of dynamite being used to drop on the wreck, to blow it up and dislodge the bodies of the dead millionaires and have them float to the surface. That's a true story. This was actually discussed. This plan was abandoned when scientists suggested that the bodies would probably be pulverized by the pressure, which ironically is something that also turned out not to be the case. In 1914, 2 years after Titanic sank, an architect from Denver proposed raising Titanic with electromagnets, and his idea was to trawl the area where the ship sank, have the magnets, when they were close to the wreck, be drawn to Titanic's steel hull and latch on, and then he wanted to add further magnets so that the ship could be pulled up to the surface by a fleet of barges. And then lastly, in the 1960s, an underwater factory worker named Douglas Woolley came up with the idea of floating the ship to the surface using gas-filled balloons. Woolley must have been an incredible salesman because he was even able to raise money for this. He set up the Titanic Salvage Company with the aim of bringing the ship to Liverpool, where it could be turned into a floating museum. And to nobody's surprise, the scheme was abandoned when they couldn't work out how the balloons would be filled with gas at the bottom of the ocean. Anyways, getting back to the story, over the next decades, treasure hunters and scientists continued to be fascinated by the problem of one, finding and then raising Titanic, which rested in an unknown place at the bottom of the ocean. In the 1980s, new hope was given to the exploration for the ship because of the conflict that drove so much innovation and change during these years, the Cold War. The U.S. Navy developed a new technology that they wanted to use for scouting the wreckage of sunken submarines. It was a system called Argo and Jason, which consisted of a remotely controlled deep-sea vehicle called Argo, paired with an underwater robot called Jason that could roam the sea floor, that could take close-up pictures of whatever it found. Because the Navy needed to test out the technology before using it for more secret assignments, they turned to an oceanographer, Navy officer, and Titanic searcher named Robert Ballard, and they struck a deal. They hired Ballard to guide Argo and Jason down to the wreckage of the 2 sunken U.S. nuclear submarines called USS Thresher and USS Scorpion, both of which had sunk in the 1960s. The government wanted to understand the state of these nuclear devices almost 2 decades later and find out if the Soviets had been there. Unfortunately for Ballard, Titanic's wreck was basically in the middle of these two wrecks in the Atlantic. Ballard would have a month with the technology during which he'd complete all the Navy's objectives first. If he finished early and had any time left over, he could use those days to search for the ship. And so in April of 1985, Ballard finished his expedition to the USS Scorpion. He had 12 days to spare, 12 days to find the wreckage that people had been looking for over 7 decades. But despite the tight time frame, Ballard and his team planned to use every minute they had with Argo and Jason. They also had a new technique for searching that the submarine's wrecks had helped them develop. During their work with Scorpion and Thresher, they had realized that both of these vessels had imploded before hitting the ocean floor. And in their wake, they left a debris field behind them as they sank to the bottom. This debris was larger than the wrecks themselves and might stretch for miles. And so instead of looking for the massive pieces of the ship, they could find Titanic's debris field. It could almost act like a trail leading them to the actual wreckage. And after a few days of scouring the bottom of the ocean and the area where they believed the Titanic had sunk, Argo stumbled upon pieces of the hull plates of the ship. They had found the debris trail, and now it was just a matter of following it straight to Titanic's final resting place. And then on the morning of September 1st, Jason's live feed on the sea floor sent back unmistakable video footage. The ship's boiler could be seen sticking out of the ocean floor. Ballard and his crew had done the impossible. They had found the wreck of the Titanic. At first, the reaction of everybody on board the surface ship was to celebrate. They cheered and popped champagne, but it didn't take long for everyone to remember exactly what they were looking at. One of the crew members shouted out, "Look at the clock. It's 2 a.m. The ship sinks in 20 minutes. This is, of course, a famous reference to the exact moment experts believe Titanic fully went under at 2:20 a.m. in April of 1912. Ballard said it sobered everyone up. Titanic was the resting place for more than 1,500 people who had gone down with the ship. Even though its discovery was a great accomplishment, it was still a site of a historic tragedy and deserved to be treated with reverence and respect. So he and his staff observed a moment of silence. The famous bow is still largely recognizable. Other areas like the stern, however, were ruined from damage during the sinking. The ship is, of course, deteriorating to this day. There's arguments from experts as to how long the ship still has to look like even the ruins that we see today. But amazingly, in subsequent dives, they found some of the interiors are still decently well preserved. To highlight one of them would be the Turkish baths, which were first-class accommodations. Basically was a spa-like facility that first-class passengers could pay $1 for, which is about $31 in today's money. And you'd have access to the facilities to be able to relax during the day. This is a then and now photo showing just how well preserved they are even to this day. When Ballard made his discovery, it of course made headlines around the world, with Argo sending out the first pictures of Titanic since her sinking 73 years before.